there, I'm about to read chapter 4 of One Perfect Summer. If you haven't heard chapters 1 through 3, make sure you go back and listen to those first. We have met the three sisters who are meeting for the very first time after a DNA test has indicated that they are half-sisters, and they're meeting at a cabin in Tahoe. And let's get on with chapter 4, because I think you'll get to meet in this chapter, or you'll get to see in this chapter their first meeting. Serenity stood in front of the wall of photographs at her family's cabin. She'd seen these pictures so many times she scarcely looked at them anymore. There were several of the lake itself. Tahoe straddled the border between California and Nevada and was the largest alpine lake in North America. Behind only the Great Lakes by volume, and with mountains on every side, it was a popular subject for photographers and painters. She had several representations in her house in Berkeley, purchased mostly from the local vendors and galleries that capitalized on the unique beauty of the area. Emerald Bay was particularly gorgeous. A spectacular shot of it showing Finette, the lake's only island, with touches of snow contrasting with the vivid blue of the water, hung right before her in the center of everything. But Serenity was more interested in the many pictures surrounding it. There was one of her and her three siblings in front of the Christmas tree when they were children, shortly after her parents purchased the cabin. One was of her father holding her in front of him while they sledded down a hill. And there was one of her with her brother, two sisters, and mother stretched out on the narrow strip of rocky sand that served as the closest beach, white-capped mountains in the background. The temperature in summer ranged from the low 40s to the mid-70s, and Serenity remembered that day as being too chilly to get in the water. But it had been warm by Tahoe standards, so there'd been a lot of sunbathers and swimmers who didn't care. Normally, Serenity would have smiled at the pleasant memories associated with these pictures. She and her family had spent so much time at the lake. The smell of tree sap that hit her the moment she opened the door made her feel as though she'd come home, even though she'd grown up in the Bay Area, not far from where she lived now. But after learning she had two half-sisters, neither of whom had ever been mentioned, she couldn't view these photos with the same blissful ignorance she once had. They looked almost fake to her, staged, and that brought so many questions to mind, as well as a profound sense of loss. "Damn it," she muttered, peering closer at a small picture of her parents laughing at a casino on the south side of the lake from back in the 80s. They'd always been elegant, and thanks to the money they'd inherited from her father's parents shortly after they were married, they'd also been well-to-do, the quintessential upwardly mobile California couple. Both were in their 50s now, but they hadn't changed much. Her father was a successful real estate attorney who worked in San Francisco's financial district until they moved to San Diego. Her mother was an organic gardener who sold her produce and flowers to local restaurants looking for farm-to-fork produce. Charlotte had also supported a lot of charities while Serenity was growing up, focused mostly on raising money for cancer research, since Beau had once battled leukemia. Serenity had always considered her parents to be young for their age, hip, open-minded, smart. So what reason would people like that have to hide the details of her birth? Knowing her parents as well as she did, what they believed in, what they stood for, she felt they would have been upfront with her if it was simply a matter of being unable to get pregnant. It had to be something else. What happened back then? She asked their still images. Why do I have two half-sisters you've never mentioned or acknowledged? And why did I have to find out about them the way I did? She nibbled at her bottom lip as she tried to remember any telltale signs, whispering, the sense that her parents were holding back or hiding something important, any strangers in her life, from when she was a child. She'd been racking her brain ever since she'd learned about Reagan and Lorelei, but she couldn't come up with a single thing that seemed odd or unusual. Maybe her parents were superior actors, or they'd simply forgotten anything they didn't care to remember, put it behind them, and moved on. After all, when she was born, there'd been no internet, no smartphones, no DNA companies like 23andMe. Her parents probably never dreamed that technology would eventually reveal what they'd hidden, even if they both kept their mouths shut. That was another thing. Were they both in on the secret? Had they made a pact between them? Or was it something only one knew and the other might not be pleased to find out? There were so many possibilities. Maybe she wasn't related to either one of them. But if she was adopted, where did she come from? And how did she wind up in their family? The sound of a car outside sent a prickle down Serenity's spine. When the engine went off, she cast a final glance at the photos of her parents and the siblings she'd grown up with and squared her shoulders. This was the point of no return. By welcoming Reagan, Lorelei, and Lucy into her life, she could wreck relationships that were dearer to her than any others. especially because she was doing it without consulting her parents. But she didn't feel she could consult them, not until she had a clearer understanding of what might have happened. She was afraid it might split them up or send one of her siblings into an emotional freefall. And yet, turning a blind eye to what she'd discovered wasn't an option. Ignoring what she'd learned wasn't sustainable, not for someone like her who had to face the truth head on. She made a living uncovering dark secrets. So, for better or for worse, she, Lorelei, and Reagan were going to get to know each other and try to figure out how they were related. Maybe once they started to delve into the past, they'd find a string they could tug on that would unravel the whole story. Before she could reach the main entrance downstairs, she heard the distressed voice of someone trying to console a crying child. The child had to be Lucy. Bracing herself, as much to meet her new family members as against the cold, Serenity opened the door just as Lorelei and her daughter came hurrying up the steps, gripping the railing tightly so they wouldn't fall while sheltering their faces from the wind and snow. "Lucy has to go to the bathroom," Lorelei announced without preamble. Serenity drew a steadying breath. Based on the photographs she'd seen, she wasn't surprised, but Lorelei looked just like her. It was uncanny, unsettling. "Down the hall on the right," she said, quickly stepping to the side. Reagan took longer to reach the porch because she'd grabbed some of the luggage, which was smart. It would only be harder to go out later when it was colder and darker and the vehicle would be buried in snow. "I'm glad you made it safely." Feeling awkward at finally facing someone who was closely related to her and yet a complete stranger, Serenity reached out to take one of the suitcases Reagan carried. "That one's Lucy's," Reagan told her. "Lorelei will have to go out and get her own. This was all I could carry." No problem. Serenity had known that coming face to face with these two people might be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated that this moment would feel quite so surreal. Although she didn't want to be obvious, she let her gaze sweep over Reagan several times. The visual proof made everything in the DNA report undeniable. "How was your flight?" Reagan seemed reticent. Was she feeling the same emotions, the shock and betrayal, as well as the excitement engendered by such a strange situation? Serenity couldn't have felt more odd if she'd come face to face with an alien from outer space. "Better than the drive here," she replied. Serenity got the impression Lucy had significantly contributed to the difficulty, so she didn't press any further. Well, fortunately, that's behind you, and I've got a fire going in the living room upstairs." Hoping to cover nervousness with politeness, she waved Reagan in ahead of her and managed to wrestle the door shut despite the howling wind. "Whew, I can't believe it's storming like this in May." Small talk when there's so much more to say. "Just my luck," Reagan, she thinks that part obviously. "Just my luck." Reagan dropped her own luggage, which looked far more expensive than what Serenity had seen Lorelei's so far. Wouldn't you know it, the weather in New York was nearly 80 degrees when I took off from LaGuardia. "Hopefully this will blow through. The weather this time of year is normally beautiful." Serenity couldn't stop watching her and noticed that Reagan couldn't quit staring either. "Are you hungry? Did you have a chance to eat after you landed?" It took Reagan a moment to respond. They were both transfixed. "Yeah, sorry, it's just, you look so much like me. So does Lorelei. The situation is definitely unique." "Right, we knew that coming into it, but you asked if we've eaten. Lorelei had a meal packed for Lucy, and she and I just grabbed something out of a vending machine." "Then you must be ready for something more. I brought groceries. I thought I'd make broccoli cheddar soup for dinner." "Sounds delicious." The conversation once again fell by the wayside as they stood and gaped at each other. "I can't believe I'm related to you," Reagan said, her voice barely a whisper. "But I have to admit, it's like looking in a mirror." Serenity didn't know whether to hug her or not. It hadn't been a possibility when she'd walked through the door carrying so much baggage, but now they were both empty-handed. "Except that my hair is not as long as yours. Except for my hair's a lot longer than yours." Another meaningless statement made because of nerves and self-consciousness. "Are we doing the right thing?" Reagan asked with a degree of trepidation. "I mean, this is kind of a risk, isn't it?" That answered the hugging question. They were going to be open and honest with each other, not pretend to feel emotions they didn't yet feel. "I have no idea," Serenity replied. "But even if we aren't, I have to know how this happened. Why it happened, and why no one ever told me. Don't you?" Reagan continued to study her closely and ultimately nodded. "I'm glad you came," Serenity said, that we'll have a chance to get to know each other. "I should warn you that Lorelei and I haven't started off on the best foot," she said, but then the door to the bathroom opened. As Lorelei led Lucy out, Reagan added a softly spoken, "Never mind." Serenity wasn't sure what that meant. She hoped it was just the result of jangled nerves from having a 4-year-old who was tired of being restrained in the car. "Lorelei," she said, turning to greet her other sister, "thanks for coming." Lorelei didn't seem happy either. She certainly didn't step up for an embrace. She seemed gun-shy, like an animal who stands back and watches warily, making sure it's safe before venturing closer. Considering what Serenity knew about her background, that made sense. She probably wasn't someone who could trust easily. "Thank you," she said. This is a really nice place." Serenity quickly sized up both sisters now that they were all standing close. They were both pretty. Lorelei had a softer, more full-figured look. Well-dressed Reagan seemed to be on the cutting edge of fashion, which made sense since her mother was a designer. Her features were a bit more angular, and she came off as decisive and in charge. "It is, but you should see the other, quote, cabins they have up here. Some are even called chalets," she said with a laugh that she hoped would at least partially conceal her discomfort. "They're owned by very wealthy people and go for millions of dollars." Lorelei's eyes were wide as she looked around. "This one can't be cheap." The comment reminded Serenity that they all came from such different backgrounds, and Lorelei had very little in way of creature comforts growing up. "It didn't cost a whole lot when my parents bought it, but that was 30 years ago. They've added on and improved it quite a bit, and real estate values have gone up." Serenity gestured at the suitcase she'd taken from Reagan and left inside the doorway. Reagan was nice enough to bring in Lucy's bag, but that was all she could carry along with her own. "Do you want to grab your luggage while I show Reagan to her room?" "Sure." She looked from Serenity to Reagan and back again, as though she, too, thought they might have fallen into an alternative universe. Obviously, Serenity wasn't the only one struggling with this moment. "I left it unlocked," Reagan volunteered. Finally, Lorelei turned to her daughter. "Sit right here where it's warm," she told Lucy, gesturing to the soft leather couch. "Mommy will be right back." After Lorelei had buttoned her coat and headed back into the storm, Reagan lowered her voice. "This might be harder than we initially imagined," she confided. "Because of..." Serenity didn't say Lucy's name, but jerked her head in the child's direction. "No, that wouldn't be a problem by itself. I'm referring to the fact that we were all raised by different families, have different backgrounds and experiences, and come with a different emotional makeup, maybe even a few scars. Will we be able to get along for an entire week? Of course, all we have to do is remain open-minded and understanding." A very California thing to say. That isn't how a New Yorker would handle it. A New Yorker would be less euphemistic about the whole situation. Serenity glanced at Lucy, who was sitting dutifully in the small family room that formed the hub of the lowest level of the cabin, watching them with red, swollen eyes. This little person was her niece. Her first niece, since none of her siblings had any children, which only made the whole thing more bizarre. "What about a Floridian?" she asked. Reagan shrugged as if to indicate it was anyone's guess. "As I said, 3 different perspectives." Serenity went over to say hello to Lucy and introduce herself. She couldn't get the little girl to respond. Lucy just kept ducking her head shyly. But Serenity couldn't blame her. This was an unusual experience for her, too. Straightening, she drew on the familiarity they'd gained interacting online to try and establish some normalcy. They'd all been rather guarded so far, but they did have some frame of reference. "It's only a week, Reagan." Reagan didn't seem convinced. A week can feel like an eternity. "It should be enough to tell us if we ever want to do this again." Serenity laughed, this time in an attempt to encourage Reagan to relax. She understood having second thoughts. She'd had a few of her own. "If you say so." Reagan stood back and gazed up the stairs. "How many bedrooms does this place have?" Grateful that she'd no longer be standing there, feeling out of place despite the fact that this was her cabin, Serenity grabbed Reagan's suitcase. 5, plus a library in the loft. She didn't bother to add that the 5th bedroom was off the loft and that it was stuffed with boxes her parents hadn't bothered to haul down to San Diego with them. It didn't matter. They weren't going to need that room anyway. "Wow, 5 bedrooms and a library? You could have an army of siblings come stay with you, all at once." "Don't say that," she muttered ruefully. "After what's happened to us, you never know." "Exactly." This time they both laughed, and Serenity felt a wave of relief. Maybe a shared joke wasn't a huge connection, but it was a start. So next, for chapter 5, we're going to go into Reagan's point of view if you continue to read. And I hope that you will grab a copy and finish the story and figure out how the 3 girls are related as they do, and see them grow and get to know each other and overcome their differences. So anyway, hope you enjoyed the reading and that you will finish the book on your own.